The Hands of the White Wizard, the latest campaign supplement for the One Ring 2nd edition by Free League, is a beautiful, beautiful thing. It is a work of art. It is absolutely perfectly Tolkienian in its writing and in its execution and in its art. And it is also a campaign that I will probably never run. Stick around, I'll tell you why. Hands of the White Wizard is a campaign supplement by Free League for the One Ring 2nd edition. It is made up of 6 different adventures that are all designed to be played over the course of about 60 years or so. In the campaign, you play the servants of Saruman, and you begin when Saruman, of course, is still very much a good guy, long before he falls to the shadow. In fact, that is a central conceit of the whole campaign, is you are observing Saruman fall to the shadow over the course of this time, but your actions can actually change that outcome, which is something that we'll talk about a little later. The individual adventures are tremendously good. They're all very different. And I have to say this, I've said this before about the One Ring, whether that's 1st edition or 2nd edition, that I have never seen a product that more perfectly represents and encapsulates its source material than this does. 2nd edition is no different than 1st that way. It is magnificent. In fact, there are parts of the writing in this book that, I swear to God, it's like the spirit of Tolkien inhabited these writers for just a second, because you can feel his essence coming through on the page. It really is just masterfully done. So huge kudos to Free League and the writing staff. The first adventure takes you into Dunland, where you have to deal with all kinds of cool stuff going on in there. There's a lot of social encounters. There's a lot of councils that happen there. The second adventure deals with this tiny little village in the middle of nowhere that's been visited by a giant black Numenorian vessel. That vessel is detailed in previous supplements, Tales from the Lone Lands and Ruins of the Lost Realm. This campaign assumes that you're going to use those. You don't have to, but it assumes you're going to draw upon the stuff that they've already published, and that's a great way to really fill out this campaign, because even though this campaign does take place over the course of 60 years, there's only 6 adventures in this book. So it's assumed that in a full campaign, obviously, you're going to be filling it with all other kinds of adventures. So they provide all kinds of ways to work in a lot of the other adventures from those other 2 supplements. So that's really cool. The third adventure is very cool. It deals with hunting orcs all the way up to Moria, to the gates of Moria, possibly even in Moria as well. The fourth one really deals with that black Numenorian ship in great detail. In fact, there's a big old mass combat that can happen there as well, and it has very simplified rules for how to handle that stuff as well. Chapter 5 is the Quest of Moria. This is where the characters actually go into Moria itself to take care of some things and to discover some things and explore some things, which is great. And then finally, the last adventure is called the Ithelstone, where the player characters are actually sent to Mordor itself, into Minas Ithil, through Ithilien, into the Morgul Vale, which is very, very, very cool. Very, very dangerous to be going into Mordor, especially around the year 3000, which is when this takes place, only 18 or so years before the events of The Lord of the Rings. So this book, the adventures themselves are all varied. They're all different in terms of their focus. It gives you all kinds of ways to handle different sort of approaches the players might take, which keeps it nice and open. So none of these really feel particularly railroady, which is nice. And yet all of them all sort of wrap up with a nice narrative structure as well. Like there's a satisfying conclusion to all of these as well, for the most part. It is extraordinarily well done. The cool little maps are great. The art is, as always, fantastic. You really can't go wrong with this stuff. It's just really, really good. The overall quality of the book itself is super, super solid. This is a great supplement, and if you are a fan of the One Ring 2nd edition and you're a GM who wants to really have the structure for a massive epic campaign, then you really cannot go wrong with this. This is a fantastic supplement, and I heartily recommend it. Now, all of that said, why wouldn't I myself run it as a campaign? Well, I'm glad you asked. So here's the thing. The entire campaign is strung together with the idea that you are servants of Saruman. But a core idea, a core conceit of the structure is that Saruman is gaining shadow as the years go on. Ultimately, this culminates in the year 3000, where Saruman stares into the Palantir and is ultimately corrupted by Sauron and really, really completes his fall into darkness. But the conceit of this campaign is that you, as the player characters, might actually prevent that from happening. Your actions will determine the level of shadow that Saruman gains. There are multiple outcomes at the end based on the shadow that Saruman has accumulated. So that very cool setup for the campaign is, in fact, the very thing that makes me go, oh, no, not for me. Now, why is that? To me, anything that can affect the canon of the Lord of the Rings in a game that I'm running that's set in Middle-earth, that's no bueno. You cannot have that. You cannot have anything that the players can do, or otherwise anybody can do, that is going to have some effect on the outcome of Frodo's quest. Cannot do it. Because to me, the books are sacrosanct. They are sacred writings. They are sacred texts. And I never want to do anything in a game that's going to throw that into jeopardy. Now, you're either going to be one of two types of player. You're either going to be the type of player like me that says, no, the canon is sacred. We do not affect that ever. Or you're going to be the kind of player that says, the hell are you talking about? Canon's there to be destroyed. Come on, we want to go and hunt down the Nazgul before they're fully formed and take them out, and we want to go push Sauron off a cliff. Ha, won't that be great? We'll change the outcome of the Lord of the Rings. Won't that be great? And to me, that makes my blood boil, and it makes me shudder with horror, because imagine that you've run that game, you've run that campaign, and the players have taken the One Ring themselves. They've become Lords of Gondor themselves. Everything is just all up in the air. Everything's completely different. If I was in that game, then the next time I went to read Lord of the Rings, it would be poisoned to me, because it's not like the words on the page have changed. They're exactly the same as they always were. But in my mind, suddenly I would be reading the Lord of the Rings going, well, that's not how it happened. Tolkien would suddenly be turned into fanfic. That was always my fear, and I hold to it to this day. Now, when the One Ring First Edition came out, I had the same trepidation. I was like, ooh, I don't know. I don't know if I want to do this. But the first edition, again, did something very, very smart. They set the campaign 5 years after the events of The Hobbit. And they set the campaign in Wilderland, which is a place that we know really nothing about, or very little about, in terms of what happened during the War of the Ring. We know for sure that Frodo never went through there. The Quest of the Ring and everything as described in Lord of the Rings had nothing to do with Wilderland. Therefore, things were pretty much fair game. There was no canonical characters in Wilderland that we could mess with that would somehow affect the outcome of the books. Now, since that is very important to me, since that is something that me and my players were very, very, very bent on, we were never going to affect canon. The idea in this campaign that the players could actually save Saruman from falling into shadow, that was a massive red flag for me. There's no way I would ever allow that to happen for the reasons I just outlined. This campaign is completely predicated on that. You track the shadow of Saruman after every adventure. And over the course of those years, how he responds is going to be based on the level of shadow he has. So there is a world in which you do everything perfectly right, and he doesn't fall. In fact, they describe in this book, at the very end, what it would be like if the player characters actually prevented Saruman's fall. And I read that and I shuddered with horror, because it's not the Lord of the Rings. And again, it's like the Tolkien's work is suddenly fanfic. Now, I know this all sounds crazy to some of you, but I'm telling you, this is a big deal. For me, canon is a sacred thing, and I don't mess with it. If I have any respect or love for the setting, and there is no setting that I have greater respect or love for than Middle-earth, there's no way I'm going to do it. So the entire idea of this campaign is you could change canon. You could change the outcome. And that's just, I can't do it. Now, the other part to that is you track Shadow of Saruman, okay? So the game, the campaign is already heavily weighted in favor of everything turning out exactly as it is in the book, right? In fact, unless you pick the one option as the GM at the very beginning, which really does give the players a chance to break canon, it's probably going to wind up exactly the same. But that begs the question to me, well, if that is the case, then why are you bothering to track all of this shadow? If really his fall is just a foregone conclusion, as it must be if you respect canon, then why are you bothering tracking all of this stuff and giving the players the illusion that they could actually change something? So let me be clear. This book is very clear about that. It sets it out. right off the top. It says, look, here's the thing that can happen. The players could actually save Saruman. Now, if you're the GM and you don't want that to happen, then here's how to make sure that doesn't happen. But again, if you go with that route, then there's no point tracking the shadow over the course of the adventures, and therefore it's kind of meaningless, right? Now, how would I fix this? Well, there actually is a fix, and that fix was perfectly represented by what they did with this. This is The Darkening of Mirkwood. This is a first edition campaign. This campaign takes the place over 30 years, and it all takes place in Wilderland. This is one of the best campaigns I ever ran. This supplement did it right. Now, why? Why did this supplement do it right where the One Ring, I think, or the Hands of the White Wizard kind of falls down a bit on this one issue? The Darkening of Mirkwood, as I said, already takes place in essentially a non-canonical part of the setting, right? Again, we don't know a lot of detail about what happened with Dol Guldur and Dale and Erebor and the Woodland Realm. We know a little bit from the appendices at the end of Return of the King, but we don't know a ton. In this game, you encounter all kinds of canonical characters. You encounter Gandalf, you encounter Saruman, you encounter Aragorn at one point. I even threw Gollum in there at one point as a sort of a brief little Easter egg cameo sighting. But at no time can you actually affect them in such a way that they're going to change what they're going to do. That is the core difference between these two. In this campaign, the whole point is to change Saruman's outcome. This has no such illusions. This says we know that there's nothing we can do to stop the events of Lord of the Rings from transpiring exactly as they are. So what we're going to do is, instead of dealing with Saruman the White, we're going to extrapolate non-canonical characters who are very much associated with canonical characters. And we're going to focus on them. So, for example, in this campaign, you do deal with Radagast the Brown all the time. There are moments where you deal with Saruman. You deal with Gandalf a number of times. But the real focus of this campaign is the people in their orbit. So there is a woodman town called the Black Tarn, which is a village that the players have a chance to fortify or to rescue or to save or to watch be destroyed or whatever. And that village is populated with characters, none of whom are in canon, but all of whom are connected very closely to canonical characters or canonical locations. So over the course of the campaign, the players got to know these NPCs in a very, very intimate way in many, many cases. So they had a big vested interest in the outcome of the fates of those NPCs. At the end of the campaign, Dol Guldur was ascended because of course it was. You can't stop that. But they had an opportunity to prevent the worst of the power of Dol Guldur from spreading out into the woodman villages and destroying them, which they did. And it cost them their lives at the end. It was one of the most epic endings ever. And at no time was canon threatened. This, on the other hand, must needs change Tolkien's writing or give the players the false hope of changing Tolkien's writing, changing the outcome of the War of the Ring entirely. Or you can do what I'm suggesting, and you can actually tie the player characters to central NPCs that are non-canonical. In fact, in the first adventure of this campaign called The Beast of Dunland, you take counsel with a Dunlanding lord and his young daughter, who of course will survive the 60 years and could be a thread for the player characters from the beginning all the way to the end. Now, these characters are highly tied to what Saruman wants, right? They're highly tied to the political situation going on around Orthanc. They're tied to Saruman's attempt to try and find allies within the region because he knows that the War of the Ring is eventually going to come. So what I mean is, instead of tracking Saruman's shadow points, whose fate you cannot affect, instead you're tracking the accumulating shadow of this family, this entire family line that is connected to Saruman in the same way that you are, because you're all ostensibly serving Saruman. But as the years go on and the player characters get to know this family line, right, whether that's the father or the daughter or other NPCs that could emerge in those 60 years, now those characters are connected intimately to the player characters. Now those NPCs are important to the player characters, and now they have a vested interest in actually trying to save them from the shadow. And because they're non-canonical, it's okay if they don't. I mean, the tragedy is still very much there, and that's what you want. You want the tragedy of falling into shadow. That's what this whole thing about Saruman is. but it's better if you use non-canonical characters to do it. That way you get to preserve the canon and still have the tragedy of the fall into shadow, which is really, I think, what the campaign's trying to go for anyway. That's not to say that you can't talk to Saruman. Of course you can. Just like you could in The Darkening of Mirkwood, you could deal with canonical characters. You just couldn't change what they were going to do in The Lord of the Rings. So that is one way that I would use to sort of, I hesitate to say fix, because it's not really a fix if you don't think it's a problem. As I said, if you are the kind of player that has no problem with breaking canon, then none of what I'm saying is going to make any difference to you, and you could look at this thing and say, that's great. Our players want to become Saruman and take the ring for ourselves and all that kind of stuff, which, well, I'd never be at your table, I'll tell you that. But all the power to you if that's exactly what you guys want to do. At the end of the day, this is a beautiful supplement that is so in keeping with the spirit of Tolkien and the spirit of Middle-earth. It is an excellent campaign, as long as you understand that you have to sort of fill it out with a bunch of other adventures, but most GMs want to do that anyway. But if you are leery of affecting canon, I would suggest deriving non-canonical characters from the canon and using them as kind of your guinea pigs to do things with. That way, you get to have the best of both worlds. You get to experience this campaign in its fullness, which is fantastic, and at the same time, you get to prevent canon from being threatened by the actions of those pesky player characters. All in all, great stuff. Wonderful supplement, and if you are a fan of the One Ring 2nd Edition, I heartily recommend you get it. Thanks for joining me, and we will see you next time on Me, Myself, and I.